Good afternoon, fellow alumni and guests joining us here today. My name is Daniel Ferrick and I'm the Alumni Relations Officer here at Trinity Development and Alumni, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, Inspiring Ideas at Trinity on Building an Inclusive Curriculum, Academic and Student Perspectives. You may have noticed we're using Zoom-generated automatic subtitles. To turn these subtitles on or off, simply click the CC closed caption button at the bottom of your screen and click Show or Hide Subtitles. Today, I'm delighted to welcome our host, Dr. Rachel Hoare, Project Director of the Inclusive Curriculum Project at Trinity College Dublin, and guest speakers, Dr. Roja Fazeli, Associate Professor of Islamic Civilization at Trinity College Dublin, and Dr. Philomena Mullen, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Trinity College Dublin. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Professor Michael Shevin, previously advertised, will not be able to participate in this webinar. In today's webinar, Dr. Hoare will lead a discussion with our guest speakers on building an inclusive curriculum for an increasingly diverse Trinity. They will cover how Trinity is taking on this challenge, why it's important to develop an inclusive curriculum, what are academics doing on the ground to make their curriculum more inclusive, and what is the student perspective and how do we give them a voice. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for later viewing on our Trinity Development and Alumni YouTube channel. The discussion today will last around 50 minutes to an hour, including Q&A from the audience interwoven into the conversation. Please do send in your questions as they occur to you and include your course and year of graduation. Thank you to all of you who submitted a question in advance of today. We hope to wrap up this webinar by 2 p.m. local time Ireland. Now I'd like to introduce our host, Dr. Rachel Hoare, who will then introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Rachel Hoare is a lecturer in the School of Languages, Literature and Cultural Studies and Project Director of the Inclusive Curriculum Project at Trinity College Dublin. As a student who accessed university herself through a non-traditional route, she has always been passionate about ensuring that her students experience inclusive learning practices. Rachel has been a college tutor and disability liaison officer for her school for more than 20 years. In addition to her academic roles, Rachel is an expressive arts psychotherapist who works with unaccompanied refugee minors, providing trauma-focused training to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Dublin. Rachel was awarded the Trinity College Civic Engagement Award in 2020 in recognition of her work in this area. Rachel's research focuses on language, identity, and migration with a specific focus on the lived experiences of people who have been forcibly displaced, and she places a strong emphasis on collaborative engagement in research with community partners. Thank you very much, Dr. Hoare, for leading us on this discussion today. And now I'll hand over to you.
Many thanks, Dan. Hello, everybody, and thanks for all coming along today. So as Dan has already said, we're going to be discussing academic and student perspectives with a big emphasis on student perspectives on building an inclusive curriculum. And our two experts here each have extensive experience in this area. So I'd like to first introduce you to Dr. Roja Fazeli. Roja is an Associate Professor of Islamic Civilizations in Trinity College Dublin, and she's also Warden of Trinity Hall, which is a residential community of 1,000 students. Roja has published widely on the subjects of Islamic feminism, female religious authorities, women's rights in Iran, and the relationship between human rights and religion. Her most recent book is Islamic Feminism, Rights and Interpretations Across Generations in Iran. She's currently on the editorial board of the journal Religion and Human Rights and is a member of the Executive Committee of the Immigrant Council of Ireland. Roja also serves as the representative for Scholars at Risk at Trinity College Dublin. She previously served on the executive boards of the Irish Refugee Council, UN Women Ireland, the Association for the Study of Passionate Societies, as well as the Board of Directors of Amnesty International Ireland. You're very welcome, Roja. We also have here, delighted to have Dr. Philomena Mullen. Phil is a graduate in English and Philosophy from Trinity College Dublin. Her MPhil in Women's Studies analysed the role of women as perpetrators of violence during the 1994 Rwandan genocide. She returned to Trinity College as a Government of Ireland PhD scholar to examine the racist and racialised aspects of how Black mixed race women who grew up in the Irish institutional care system without families constructed their identity. She spent 18 years working in the NGO sector, a great deal of which was with the Irish Traveller movement. She was a member of the National Consultative Committee on Racism and Interculturalism and the European Network Against Racism. She sits on the advisory committee of the Trinity Colonial Legacies Project. She's a board member of the Association of Mixed Race Irish and a member of African Scholars Association in Ireland. She has recently developed the first Black Studies module in Trinity College Dublin, delivery of which commenced last week. Her research interests include the racialisation of children of Black and African Irish descent in institutions and the historical presence of Africans in Ireland and in Trinity College Dublin. So you're both very welcome. Looking forward to the discussion. Before I tell you a little bit more about the Trinity Inclusive Curriculum Project, Trinity Inc. for short, and also in the interest of prioritising the student voice, I'd like to firstly introduce you to 3 Trinity College students who are currently working with us on the Trinity Inclusive Curriculum Project as student partners. They were each asked the question, what should an inclusive curriculum look like? So firstly, you're going to hear from, and these are just 1-minute videos, you're going to hear from Husna. She's a 2nd year pharmacy student. She'll be followed by Alex, who's a 4th year physics student. And finally, we have Alice, who's a final year English student. Thank you, Dan.
My perspective on building an inclusive curriculum is a curriculum that is set by the students and for the students. And this can be done by collecting regular feedback during the term and utilising and valuing the feedback given, being flexible to change the curriculum and cater it towards the students during the year. Also understanding that there isn't one way of teaching, there isn't one golden way of learning, that all students are different, therefore they're going to learn differently, and to use a combination of media to teach a material. So for example, presentation, podcast, videos, recorded lectures, workshops or practicals. The list, I could go on and on. And this makes sure that the curriculum set is inclusive and allows all students to learn. So because some students may grasp the material during a presentation, but others may actually understand what's being taught during a workshop.
My name is Alex. I'm a final year physics student who came into Trinity through the foundation course with the Trinity Access programs. I suppose an inclusive curriculum to me and what it means would be a curriculum that is open to everybody, regardless of upbringing, regardless of socio-economic background, where you come from, how you look, whether you have a disability, whether it's hidden or visible. This curriculum is for you, and there's no barriers there that are going to stop you from participating as equally and with as much enjoyment in college as every other student. And I suppose it's about recognizing diversity and inclusion, but also recognizing that every student is the same in terms of how they should be treated, but not every student is the same in terms of the accommodations they need to equally access college and academia. And that's what an inclusive curriculum would mean to me.
Hi there, my name's Alice and I'm going into my final year of English Studies here at Trinity. I joined Trinity Inc. because I'm visually impaired. I have a convergence insufficiency, which basically means that my eyes refuse to work together. It's kind of rude of them. And so I get double vision or multi-vision pretty much all the time. And that causes intense photosensitivity and in turn migraine due to visual exhaustion with aura as well. I think that an inclusive curriculum is one in which kind of obstacles are removed for everybody. And if there are obstacles that are left after we've worked to get rid of them, then we're just going to work even harder to take those ones down, and we're going to find as many ways around them as possible so that absolutely anyone and everyone who wants to learn can, because that's the most important thing. If you've got the drive, you should be able to do whatever you want. And I think that's what Trinity Inc. is here to do. We're here to help you. We're here to make sure that everybody can do whatever it is that they want to do. Okay, thank you.
So a big thank you to our 3 students there, and they worked on our summer student summer partner program that was part of our Trinity Inclusive Curriculum project, which I'm going to tell you about a little bit about at the moment. So they provide us with some really valuable insights from the student perspective. So just before I tell you a little bit more about the Inclusive Curriculum project that I'm leading on at Trinity Inc., I'd just like to remind you, just to reiterate what Diana said, we'd be delighted to take your questions and comments, and you can do this by sending them into the Q&A. And when you do that, it would be great if you could include your course and class year, just so we get a bit of perspective about where you're coming from and when you were a student with us. Okay, so I'm going to now just introduce the project. Just with there's one slide here which I think summarizes the project quite well. So for those of you who haven't heard this term before, haven't thought about this term before, an inclusive curriculum is one in which all students, regardless of background, personal circumstances, or learning abilities or preferred strategies, have an equal and equitable opportunity to engage fully in their studies and achieve their learning goals. Inclusion tends to be thought about in terms of disabilities, but there's much more to inclusion than actually having a physical disability and being excluded. And that's really what we're addressing here. So we're based in the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Unit in Trinity College. Our mission statement is to support the integration of the principles of diversity, equality and inclusion across the curricula at Trinity. We're working within 4 pillars: an academic pillar, which is designed to stimulate an interest, debate and engagement at the school level in college. We all know that academics don't really like to be told how to teach, so we're not going to go in and dictate to colleagues how to that they have to do this to improve their curricula, but we want to stimulate debate and interest and give people some hints about how to go about this without being very dogmatic. So the way in which we're doing that, we've recruited school champions for most of the schools. There are 24 schools across Trinity. So in each school, there's a school champion who will champion the cause of inclusivity within the college. And we will provide them with training, and they'll work very closely with student partners as well. So the next pillar I'm just going to talk about is the student pillar. And this is the student, we're running a student partner program, and we ran a program over the summer with 18 students who represented many different areas of diversity, and we've gained some amazing insight from those students. We've got institutional pillar as well, where we're hoping to have buy-in and promotion by university leaders, and we're trying to embed then inclusivity practices within policies. For example, when we develop new modules and programs, when we have new staff, that inclusivity will be very much on their agenda, and they will have to show how they are including students. And finally, infrastructure is kind of like a wraparound pillar. So we're collaborating with services across college, which support and enable the other pillars to achieve inclusion. Thanks, Dan. So that's just giving you a real whistle-stop tour of the project. We will provide you with some more information at the end so that you can go and look at our website, or you can get in touch. We have an advisory board which currently has 30+ members. And if you think that you have something to add to that advisory board, please do get in touch. We just meet once a semester, and then as and when required, if we need some information about a particular student cohort. So if you're interested in that, please do contact me directly or via the Trinity Inc. Email address, which we'll leave at the end. So I suppose this is to everybody. I say everybody is Roja and Phil. I'm just wondering, for yourselves, why is it necessary to develop an inclusive curriculum? What's the importance of doing that? I don't know, Phil. Would you like to start?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, for me, I suppose I would see it not only in terms of, say, representation for students on a curriculum, which is probably much more important than a lot of people would imagine, or would assume that it would have kind of any sort of impact on a student. I think I would work from within the area of race and racialization. So a lot of students who experience being raced as, let's say, not white, often complain about there being no representation in a very Eurocentric curriculum. And therefore they feel somehow marginalized by us, or they feel that the experiences, the knowledges, the cultures that they bring are degraded or ignored in some way. And therefore, to bring that knowledge into an academic setting like Trinity is really important, because Trinity is not, or is no longer, an all-white bastion of Irishness and whiteness. And so difference now is the norm rather than the exception. And I think we need to start moving in terms of recognizing that at all kinds of levels, both visibly on the campus, on the committees, and particularly in the curriculum, which is where students kind of directly confront exclusion in their courses and that. So I think that's why it's really important in terms of my area, in terms of race and that, how students are represented. I also think in areas of other, like disability and that, I think making adjustments within a university, our university setting, our college setting, is really important because we put a lot of store by our traditions and our buildings. So our physical environment, we often make inaccessible, making those adjustments that makes it possible for people with disabilities to access Trinity is probably something that Trinity has to really focus on, like taking lovely stone steps maybe away from the museum building, or putting a lift in on the outside, or stuff like this. These are all adjustments that need to be made so that it's not the student who has to make the adjustment in order for them to individually be able to access college or learning along with their peers, but that it's the college who adjusts and the environment adjusts to ensure that they can actually access like all the same environments and physical spaces that their peers can. So that's why I think it's really important.
Thanks very much, Phil. Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that students need to be reflected. They need to be able to see themselves in the curriculum, in the curricula. But also the environment, it's not about, it's about us creating an enabling environment, and that's the physical environment, but also I suppose the environment within a classroom, whether it's a classroom or a lab or a lecture theatre, to help students to feel included. So it's physical and it's that other belonging piece, isn't it? That's what's coming through very strongly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, your project, Trinity Inc., you work along the 9 grounds. So there are other invisible kind of differences, and there is still stigma attached to some of those differences. So it's a very broad kind of palette that you're trying to work with, to ensure that everybody is comfortable. And it always comes back, and when you hear students talking, they always come back to that sense of belonging. So there's a lot of discussion around diversity, and we need to increase diversity. But diversity doesn't change anything. It gives people access to somewhere, but it doesn't make it any easier to navigate around that if you haven't put in all of the structures and systems in place that people need to not only kind of survive, but to thrive within that environment. So diversity is not really what it's about. Inclusivity and that sense of belonging is what makes it worthwhile and what creates a positive learning journey for people.
Thank you. Absolutely. And just to remind people as well, those 9 grounds are gender, marital status, family status, age, disability, sexual orientation, race, religion, membership of the traveling community. Hopefully that is 9 that I've remembered. And we have representation from all of those 9 grounds, plus other grounds. And, students have come up with their own terms in our student partner program. So they don't like social disadvantage. They like the term, people from all walks of life. So we're kind of reinventing that terminology as well. And also things like caring responsibilities that some students have, that staff would not be, they wouldn't realize that students are either caring for a parent or a child. And students who've experienced homelessness is much more common than you would imagine, whether, that could be a temporary stage where they're sofa surfing, as it were. So there are many different ways in which students feel excluded. Thanks a million, Phil. Roja, would you like to add?
Well, Phil has very eloquently put a lot of things on the table. But I suppose for me, inclusivity is really based on this idea of communities of mutual learning. So community and equality are central to this, especially equality of access. And this is something I think that especially Alex and Alice really pointed to in the little videos. So syllabuses and classroom presence should be modeled on how respect for conflicting voices and rigorous empirical research can coexist. So very much like Phil, I think about how students are represented in my syllabuses, or in a sense for them to see a representation. So I teach Islamic civilization, that's kind of my field, but Islam and gender, and do some modules on human rights. So one of the things that I'm really actively trying to change is to include, for example, more female voices from Global South. So that's just one example. And I always tell the students as well, when you read, always go and look at the person you're reading, so you have a sense of where they're coming from, because we say academia is objective, is actually very subjective, and context is very important, and a lot of times like that, the students then situate themselves within or without the context. I also think student participation and classroom dialogue are very central to inclusivity. So this really comes with recognizing that each student brings a unique trove of personal and social knowledge into the classroom, so that one should treat each student accordingly with respect. So respect is really central as well. And this includes making a commitment to be accessible for questions, conversations, and ideas outside of regular class meetings as well, because we always look at class, but I think outside and beyond that space is also really important, especially when you're talking, for example, students who is working, they might miss a class, and they have no way around it, because that's how they maintain themselves. And with such high rent, for example, in Dublin right now, we need to be understanding. Or if you have, a student who is a parent, I've had the students who have asked me if they can bring their children to class, and and you can accommodate that, because that's the only way they can be part of this community of mutual learners. So the classroom for me is really a space filled with diversity of thought, rather than being an echo chamber. And this encourages self-respect, and at the same time, when fostered in a structured community of mutual respectful learners, underscores the way in which critical self-assessment and in intellectual humility are integral components of academic and public life. And really as well, we need to recognize a student with diversity of their voices as present and future leaders in the university and beyond. And I think recognizing that as well, that, this is not just about the classroom, it's about outside, and it's not just about Trinity, but that these are students who will be going to be, the leaders of tomorrow, basically.
Thank you very much, Roja. Yes, I really like this idea of learning communities, and actually, I'll mention this a lot today. But because we as I said, we ran this summer student partner program, and we had 18 students who all represented those grounds that I mentioned earlier, and other aspects as well. And one of the things that came across is well, actually, I learned so much from the students. I would consider myself as somebody who kind of knows students and enjoys interacting with students and kind of knows their issues. But after 25 years of teaching here, but actually after the summer program, I learned a huge amount. And I think, as academics, we also need to realize that we are constantly learning from our students as well, and that knowledge is being constructed. It's not just, the traditional chalk and talk way either. So thanks, Roja. That's really, really insightful. Thank you. I think you've partly answered my next question. I suppose can you tell us about any concrete things that you've done to make your curriculum more inclusive? Anybody? Who would like to go first?
You go first, Roja.
Should I go first? I've already answered that in parts, but to be honest, Rachel, it goes back to the fact that I feel I'm constantly learning. So I teach a course on Islam and gender, and the very first course, we talk about what gender is, what's the difference between gender and sexuality, and to be honest, like every single year, I learn so much from the students. And that's one thing like I have learned through teaching this syllabus is to open up that space of conversation where I can learn from the students, and also students learn from students at the same time, and also it encourages critical thinking. So the other thing as well, it's that I try to do is to ask students themselves to add any extra reading, or so we do movies, for example. I give them, like, I have a list in the syllabus, but I say, if you have any that you want to replace, for example, we can do this, or you can meet outside the classroom. I try to meet them outside the classroom. It comes with challenges, because you want to be very inclusive and you want to give time, but unfortunately, like, this is one of the challenges for me, is always to have the time. And at the moment as well, it's being online versus in person, and how to be inclusive in that sense as well, which is something else I'm learning in the past 2 weeks. So for me, it's more than anything, it's a learning curve, and I've been teaching for the last 12-13 years.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we all have to remember that, don't we? We're never going to stop learning in this job. One of the things you touched on there, Roja, I'd like to come back to, is just, the kind of multiple ways of presenting material, different ways in presenting material, because obviously, different students have different ways in which they learn. They could be visual learners, and they could be very happy with a familiar traditional way of, learning things off by heart. But what we need to do is realize that our students all have very different ways of learning. So we need to be presenting our materials in as many different ways as possible, whether it's through videos or podcasts, as well as kind of traditional learning material. And that's something that came up very strongly with our student partners. And we asked them to they produced some materials for staff, and the variety of materials that came back. A couple of students did a podcast on race. There were students who produced a poster on how to be a trans ally in the classroom, and I think that's something that we all kind of struggle with, is the pronouns, the genders, all those types of things. And so we're now looking at how to disseminate that information to staff, and it's certainly, as a member of staff, something that I was looking for information on, but it's great that it comes from the students. The other way, so that kind of covers assessment as well. So different ways of assessing, because we have learning outcomes. We all have learning outcomes for our courses, which tell people what we expect them to have learned by the end of the course. And there's many different ways of assessing that, rather than just a 2,000-word essay. So it's all about getting staff on board, training staff, raising the awareness. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Phil, did you want to add anything from your own experience there?
Yeah, I suppose I would say that I try to operate from the principle that weak writing skills don't equal weak thinking skills. So a lot of emphasis is put on essays, final essays, and in our schools sometimes it might be 70% of a mark, which to me is, that's putting a lot of pressure on students to get it right, and particularly students who are looking for very, very high marks and all of that. So to give the student opportunities to shine in other ways, incorporating other forms, like you say, for assessment, because really that's all the student's interested in. Am I going to be assessed on this? What's it worth? So that's really important for the students. So like you say, broadening out what they can do. So in my own classroom, I've incorporated 3 different types of assessments. So reflexive writing and presentations and the essay. Now, what's interesting is that the reflexive writing, which is non-academic, frightens the students much more than the other 2 pieces, because they seem to understand what's expected of them with those two pieces of work. But when you ask them to critically reflect on their learning, they really get scared, you know, and they're kind of asking you, well, what does that mean? Well, you know, but how do you judge, and how will you mark it, and all of this. So it's really interesting to see how students are corralled into being just focused on the final grade rather than the learning journey, you know, and education for the sake of education. And I do understand that, because there are kind of, you know, there's accountability at the end, and what you come out with obviously has importance in a modern world. But really, I think for me, the most important part of broadening out the curriculum is actually getting students to think about what they're actually learning on the curriculum, what impact it has on them, you know, whether it actually does have a kind of an impact, whether it changes their thinking, whether it challenges their thinking. We never really know this, because they get into a system. Once they work out what the system is for writing, that's all you get, you know, and to me, that I think is very sad. So incorporating other bits of work that allows the student to bring cultural elements in, as well as just our standard kind of academic requirements, I think is really important for the student, because once they start reflecting, then again, like you say, it becomes more subjective. They begin to understand what values they're bringing to us themselves, and what they're taking from the materials that they're engaging with. And I think this is really important, because that's when you start to get a sense of whether the material you're using is having an impact, or whether the material you're using has any sort of cross-cultural impact. You know, so students, you can see in the reflections, are engaging with some material, not all the material. Some students don't get it at all, because maybe particularly Erasmus students or non-kind of westernized students, it takes them a lot longer to engage with the material. And they're often curious as to why it's only, say, Enlightenment materials, or it's only Western materials, when they've come from systems where they've used materials from their own cultures. And that doesn't appear on any curriculum here. So it is really good method for questioning not only their learning, but also what you're providing for them. You know, so it allows you to make adjustments along the way. And to me, I think that's really important, that you get that kind of feedback along the way, in terms of whether this material is relevant at all to all students, and to the individual needs of students, you know, so.
Thanks, Phil. And it's interesting, actually, because our student partners, that's something that came up, that they wanted to give feedback mid-module. You know, we tend to evaluate the modules at the end. And I was quite surprised by that, because, you know, it's notoriously difficult to get students to give you feedback, but they just said they would prefer to have feedback midway through, and to be listened to, you know, as to how they're experiencing that course. And just coming back to what you were saying about assessment and reflexive pieces, the three of us are all involved in the Trinity electives. Phil has developed the Black Studies elective. Myself and Roja teach on the human experience of forced migration, and I think Roja teaches on another elective as well. And the Trinity electives are courses that are available for students throughout college, and they cover a wide range of topics. So you could have a physics student alongside a sociology student, alongside a nursing student in your group, and they have tended to use innovative methods of assessment. And you know, I use the reflexive piece myself, and I found I've had to give very kind of tight guidelines to students about what this needs to look like. And in my case, it's reflections on interviewing people from direct provision and people involved in providing services for refugees, and it's the reflective pieces I get are just absolutely incredible. And normally, you know, I'm not in, you know, marking isn't something I look forward to, but these pieces are it's absolutely incredible, the learning that's happened, and that's where you see the real learning, you know. So yeah, it's interesting that the electives are kind of I suppose leading the way on different ways of assessing, but it's difficult. People have been doing the same thing for years. They were taught in the same way, their teachers were taught in the same way. So it's all about trying to change that mindset. So thank you, Phil. So just coming back to then something that I kind of looked at the start, which is student voice. Just wondering, I mean, you've both touched on this as well already, but what do you think is the best way to give students a voice in the curriculum? And I know some academics would actually balk at that and say, oh my goodness, how can they dictate the curriculum? And I'm not talking about dictating it, I'm just talking about, you know, just having some kind of input and some kind of say and voice in actually what they're taught. Do either of you have anything to say about that?
I was teaching on an MPhil course last year, and at the beginning of the course, I said to the students, so what I want you to do is I want you to work with me we're going to co-create some of our curriculum this year. I mean, they all nearly ran out of the room. You know, and they were like, can you not just tell us what to do? Like, and so it's very difficult to get students at third level to unlearn practices that they've already taken on board. So they're used to a didactic system which is top down, and they sit and they learn what they're told. So to get them to come on board was really, really scary. So I think this is something that needs to happen at much earlier stages, because it's very hard to incorporate it. So if you have master's students who are balking at that idea, you know, maybe we need to start in first year, you know, because it seems to me that it's not just the lecturers or the teachers who are kind of find that idea problematic, but the students themselves don't know how to manage that. And maybe it does come through more informal environments like workshops, like the stuff you did during the summer, Rachel, where you have student partnerships and students feed into stuff like that, because they're certainly not ready to just kind of lend their voice, or they don't believe that they have the experience or the knowledge to do that, you know. So it was difficult to, and I found myself then just reverting to kind of traditional methods, because the reception wasn't great to my great idea of having the students come on board with me to co-create. So I think it's something that really has to be developed earlier on with students, and an understanding kind of given to the students, or that the students develop an understanding that actually they have a voice, that their voice is important in this, you know, because learning is dynamic, knowledge is dynamic, it's not static, you know. So just because we learn something a particular way, you know, the students can bring really, really fresh ideas and can often be very challenging in the classroom, which is great. You know, it's not great at the time, but it's great afterward, because then you've learned something and, you know, you incorporate it, and you've moved forward, you've progressed yourself in your own thinking, which is really fantastic, and it's free, you know. So I do think that we need to educate students on how to be part of the creation of curricula and syllabus, and that it's not just, you know, done in a room by individuals who make these individual choices, you know. And like Rocha said, getting the students to bring in their own material, to add to the classroom, you know, what's on offer in the classroom, I think is a really, really great idea.
Thank you. And I know one of our student partners mentioned a zoology class where somebody asked a question about animals and homosexuality, and the lecturer actually put on an extra class, you know, outside of the normal teaching hours, to talk to students about this, and the student was absolutely, you know, amazed that somebody would go out of their way to look at something that they were all interested in. So that's, you know, that's a really good example, I think, and you know, that is a little piece of co-creation. Maybe we just need to take baby steps on this, and you know, get them in to do a small piece of it at a time. Roja, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I just following from both yourself and Phil. I do think, you know, at the start, when a student starts a module, they you know, it's kind of one thing I suppose to ask is, what is their expectation of what they're going to learn in this module? it's not going to happen at the start. As Phil said, they would run because they don't know what the module is about, I suppose. So where I find students start feeling more confidence is more like once you're a few weeks in, so they engage with the material and then they know what they want. So I would do kind of something similar to the zoology professor where, you know, if I see there is interest, I would change one of the weeks and dedicate it then to what they're interested in. Because, you know, it's actually quite easy for us to do, especially if it's, but it's, you know, if it's something you're researching in, if it's your expertise. But I actually also wanted to go back to the assessment part, because it's not like one thing I found in Trinity during my time, both I was a student here as well. So I've been part and parcel of, I think I'm part of the furniture now in Trinity. I've been here for so long that it's not just, I suppose that this traditionalism around how we assess, it's something that we need to buy in a little bit more, because I've had times where I had the external examiner, for example, not very happy with my models of assessment because it's not the traditional exam or essay. So for example, I do a human rights class where I ask the students to do a human rights campaign, and trying to kind of convey what's the difference between, there is a massive difference between doing the campaign to a presentation. You know, you need to put in a lot more into it, and it gives you practical experience as well. And this is where students as well can really be part of that community of mutual learners, because they pick out what they want to do. It doesn't have to be something in the curriculum. And I suppose that's another part to talk about is like changing mindset, because and this is where we can learn so much from students, and we need to be a little bit more open around, you know, and the time, the last 2 years was a really good learning experience, because where we had, I found kind of there was resistance to changing assessment. When COVID hit, we had to do it. There was no way around it, and I hope we can all take that as a learning piece, because we all learn to be so much more flexible, and we can do that. And it worked well for students. It was difficult, but it worked well.
Thanks, Roja. Thank you very much for both of your insights here. I think we should probably move on to the Q&A now, because we want to just give people a chance to ask their questions. So I'm going to read out some of the questions here. There's one from Megan Greeley. Thank you, Megan. How is pedagogy given priority within mandatory faculty training, prioritised within faculty hiring criteria, assessed and focused on in general within Trinity Inc., as inclusive curricula often falls flat if corresponding pedagogy isn't focused on? Excellent question, Megan. I suppose Trinity Inc. is just in it's just finished its pilot year. We just started last October, and the first year has been very much information gathering, focus groups. We ran a micro-credential for our school champions. So we're now kind of coming into the phase where we want to influence the training. We want to make sure that modules and programs have, you know, when there are new modules being developed and new programs, that there is an inclusivity, and it's not just a box tick exercise that people have to show how they're being inclusive. We're also going to give training to all new staff, to tutors, and to other interested colleagues, because we realize that we can't get to, you know, not everybody is going to be interested in this. So what we're trying to do is just to disseminate the information and the insight using the student voice, which is very, very powerful, in as many ways as we can. So there'll be a real ramping up of the project this coming academic year, when we try and, you know, where we're going to go on to the college committees, the college hiring committees, the college committees which approve new modules and programs, and we're going to, you know, have a presence there and make sure that everything is inclusivity checked. And we're going to have a town hall. So we've loads of different events organized. It's all about disseminating that information and trying to get people on board. Thank you very much for the question, Megan. Does anybody want to add to that? Roja or Phil, is there anything you can think of that you'd like to add? Or I can just go on to the next question.
Yeah, go on.
Thank you. So Anne-Marie Glynn would be curious to understand how we assess the effective transition over time. So curricula can continue to be inclusive, not fixed at one point in time, and that the community in Trinity feel belonging. So again, these are all questions that are very much at the forefront of what we're doing, and they're things that we're addressing this year. You know, we're basically looking at different ways of assessing how our students are responding to these new ways of teaching, these new ways of assessing. So that is something we're very much working on. I don't have a clear answer to that question at the moment, but we are looking at ways in which we can monitor the things that we're doing and how they have an impact on the students. Lucy Hederman, who's one of our own computer science lecturers. Hi, Lucy. A lot of what is being discussed has very little relevance to a module on immunology, applied maths, or computer programming. What does Trinity Inc. Look like at the back end of college? A nice way of describing it. Yeah, so I suppose the obvious one is having people on the curriculum who are women, who are from different ethnicities, at the curriculum, but also, and I mean, this may not be relevant to computer science, but we've had students from the medical faculty, from pharmacy and medicine, who don't know what it's like. I mean, this is just an example that came up. So, what does this skin disease look like on brown skin or skin which isn't white? And they feel that things like that are not covered in the curriculum. Everything is very much based on, white skin, on the white physiology, I suppose. Computer programming, again, looking at the curricula, looking at, whose voice is being listened to here. Phil touched on this earlier. Are we just talking about a very Eurocentric approach? So it's those kinds of things. And we've had difficulties recruiting school champions from, as Lucy calls it, the back end of college. And we're working on that at the moment. We're also working with colleagues from Columbia University and from Kingston University in London, who are quite a bit further ahead in this process than we are. And they've done some very, very interesting work on looking at inclusivity in the STEM subjects. Phil, sorry, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, no, I was going to say this is an argument that's made quite regularly, but really in the terms of, say, computer programming, and that we know that the majority of people who work in this area are white and male. So that already has an impact on what sort of programs are being produced and how they're produced or developed. I don't know what the correct term is. We also look in terms of AI. And we know that in AI, Black skin is not being programmed in, or that there are programs that, where Black people are more likely to be profiled or criminalized, through these programs. So knowing this when you're working with your students is really, really important. And also what's really important is when you look at your own student body, how much diversity is there, in your student body? And are they all particular or mainly male and white? Because then that's going to give you a huge kind of knowledge about what sort of programs they're actually going to produce and what they're going to focus on. And how do you diversify that? I mean, that's already starting to look at, the curriculum, decolonizing your students that come in, and how do you bring in more diverse student body? So that's does impact on your end of college. We look at Galton, who was a eugenicist, I mean, these people did have a huge impact outside of their own fields. So yeah, I would say it does have an impact.
And I think part of our job is to make that very clear to the back end of college, as you call it, to make it very clear that it is relevant to them. So that's our job, to increase awareness and insight around that. So thanks, Lucy. It was a really good question. Susanna Doyle, does Trinity have a current course, for example, where the curriculum is all inclusive? I don't know if we can ever be fully all inclusive to all students. I'm wondering if that is, kind of an aspiration. We're all aspiring to that. But I think where you might want to look is at the Trinity electives. I'm not sure how many there are now, because there are a number have been added to. There are 40. Yeah, so those Trinity electives have been very closely vetted for, making sure that they're inclusive and that they have different assessment methods and different ways of teaching and learning. When you set up an elective, you have to really jump through many hoops, whereas many modules, you might just have to go through a school committee. So if you're interested in what's happening and what's going on, then I would definitely have a look at those. Thank you very much. Ali, what are the main challenges currently with developing an inclusive curriculum? I think the main challenge is time for academics, getting buy-in from academics. And that's why we really have to look at the many different ways of getting the information out there, of disseminating it through the school system in college, but also through the big college committees. I suppose you're never going to get absolutely everybody buying into it. What we're hoping to do as part of the project is to provide small amounts of money for people to get, say, a 2-week buyout where somebody covers their teaching, and that will enable them just to work on their teaching on a particular module to make it more inclusive. So we're working on looking at the logistics of how that would work, because we do get research leave, but of course that's not for developing modules and teaching. Thank you, Ali. Aoife, does having an inclusive curriculum mean having different versions of the same course depending on the learner, or just having one course for all learners? One course for all learners, a course which is inclusive to everybody. So it's, as Phil, I think it was Phil, it was saying earlier, if you think about the physical space, so rather than having a lift for one student, you have a lift that's there and is available to everybody. So it's all about making that learning space inclusive as well. Donatella, are you tracing the effects of inclusive curriculum implementation on the learning outcomes, not only in grade, but also the actual student evaluation of the course and module? Again, that's something that we're looking at, and we're looking at best practice in that area, and we're hoping to do some stuff on that this year. So watch this space. Thank you. So I think that's all the questions. I think Dan's going to put up a slide with the contact details of the Trinity Inclusive Curriculum Project. Again, just to reiterate what I was saying earlier, if any of you have particular expertise, whether that's by lived experience or work experience, and you'd like to, and you think you could really contribute to our advisory committee, then we'd really love to hear from you, because that advisory committee currently has 30+ members, but we're always looking for people with diverse experiences. And it would involve one meeting per semester, and then we would call on you as and when we needed some guidance on specific aspects of the project. So please do get in touch. Please look at our website and see what's happening, especially the student partner program and the materials that they developed over the summer, because we had a showcase of their materials actually a couple of weeks ago, and there was some amazing stuff came out of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you to our speakers. I'm just going to share my screen here again. That's lovely. And so yes, thank you. And yes, I want to thank our speakers here again, Dr. Rosa Frizzelli and Dr. Philomena Mullen. And of course, thank you to Rachel for being our host here today, for your insights and all your expertise. I know I want to sincerely thank you all for your time and effort in putting into this webinar, because it does take a great deal of time and prep work to produce these webinars. So I want to thank you on behalf of our team here, Trinity Development and Alumni, and of course on behalf of the alumni community, who I know really appreciate these kind of webinars. I'd also like to thank the Trinity Development alumni team who have helped put this webinar together, with a special thank you to our events and comms team, Alex Owens and Aoife Brady. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you here for listening today and for putting in your questions and making this more engaging webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. On the screen, you'll see here, hopefully, a link to the Inclusive Curriculum Project website, and we encourage you to check this website out for further information on the project. If you have any more general comments or regarding the webinar series, just email us at alumni@tcd.ie, where we're always happy to hear from our alumni community. In the meantime, our next Inspiring Ideas webinar at Trinity is How to Have a Healthy Housing System, which will take place at the regular time of 1 p.m. Irish time on Wednesday, the 6th of October. Join us for this fascinating discussion on the topic with experts Professor Ronan Lyons and economist, author and journalist David McWilliams. They will discuss the latest research and insights into the housing crisis, definitely one not to miss. We hope to welcome you again real soon. Thank you once again for joining us. Thank you to our speakers today, and goodbye and stay safe.